Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined, as I am every week, by Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back to another week of the Libertarian Angle.
Hey, it's good to be with you and with our viewers and listeners as always.
Yeah, me too. And this has been a big week, at least for people in Cuba, but also for people in the United States, with the passing of Fidel Castro, the longtime ruler and dictator of Cuba, who has really been an obsession for the U.S. government, specifically the Pentagon and the CIA, ever since his accession to power in 1959. So I thought we ought to talk about it. I think it's going to be a big issue now with Trump coming into the presidency. He's already indicated, it seems like he's going to rescind Obama's policy of establishing an openness toward Cuba. I have a feeling that Trump's going to be ramping up the embargo, that we're going to see that continuing, despite the fact that Castro's now dead, and that was the original idea behind the embargo regime change. So I thought what we would do, Richard, is talk about various aspects of Fidel Castro, Cuba, his economic policies, his educational policies, his philosophy, political and economic philosophy, and then the U.S. government's attitude toward Cuba through most of the Cold War and afterward. So why don't you start with talking about the economics of Fidel Castro, the socialist communist system that he established there, and the effects that it had on the Cuban people? Because we often hear, from the left, oh, Castro had a wonderful healthcare system and a wonderful economic system, and let's not look at all of the tyranny, the suppression, the censorship, the jailing, the executions of his political enemies, because after all, he established a really nice healthcare and educational system. What do you say about all that, Richard?
Well, let us understand the setting and the philosophy that guided him for the half century that he dominated Cuban life. He defeated Fulgencio Batista in 1959. In fact, on January 1st, 1959, his Cuban Revolutionary Forces entered Havana, with Batista having left Cuba the night before on New Year's Eve. He promised freedom for the Cuban people. He promised democratic elections. He promised an end to the corruption that had been endemic under Batista's regime. But within short period, what Castro began to do was to implement an agenda that clearly had been in his mind or his guiding principle long before, and that was the Marxian ideal of a socialist centrally planned economy with one-party rule and government domination of all aspects of life. So in short order, he began to nationalize businesses, confiscate American-owned companies, seizing Cuban-owned enterprises as well. He rapidly followed the Soviet model of introducing socialist central planning. He collectivized the land, ending virtually all private farming for all intents and purposes in Cuba, and putting it under the straitjacket of this system. The consequence is that even the standard and quality of life that the Cubans had, however imperfectly, under the previous Batista regime, soon became even worse. Indeed, they lived off the ideological charity and subsidy of the Soviet Union from the 1960s until the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Soviets provided the cash for importation of energy. They provided subsidies to maintain Cuban industry. And in turn, the Cubans provided various things that the Soviets wanted, including military facilities of one type or another. The regime ended up basically strangling Cuban society, freezing it in a time warp, if you will. Now, as you said, the left has this conception that what is important is social justice. Now, this is a Marxian conception that dates from Marx Engels themselves. They ridiculed bourgeois freedoms. Now, what are bourgeois freedoms? Bourgeois freedoms is what we in the West have traditionally called liberty: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, rule of law, the recognition of a private space around the individual in his rights as a human being, an essential element of it being private property and the right of enterprise and exchange. The Marxists always argued, again, like I said, from Marx and Engels, that this is a false consciousness. This is an illusionary freedom. Real freedom is when the means of production are in the hands of the people, and the revolutionary government, speaking for and representing the masses, manage and control the means of production for the social good as opposed to private profit. Now, as a consequence, it has been an attitude often seen by the intellectual left in Europe and in the United States that, yes, of course, it's nice that people have full freedom of speech, and if you can vote in an election, and if you're free to assemble as you want or practice your faith. But these are less important. Abridging them, even abolishing them for a period of time, can be accepted, rationalized away, viewed as essential to attain the real freedom. And the real freedom is government guaranteeing a job. Real freedom is government guaranteeing health care, a roof over your head, an education, a certain standard of living, and equality of outcomes. That is true freedom. And only a socialist government or a highly interventionist welfare state government can provide those things. Only when these have been attained, real freedom in the economic sense, these free things from government, can we be concerned with any abridgment or violation of these mere bourgeois freedoms. They're a complement, but they're not essential. A government job and government health care and government education and a government-provided roof over your head, that's more important than these other things. And therefore, the left, broadly defined in the United States and Europe, were willing to turn a blind eye, to rationalize away, to apologize for the most abusive and violations of these. But they didn't even get what was promised. The fact is that Cuba was not the United States before Castro came to power. But the data I've seen, written up by a number of qualified and knowledgeable experts that I've read, suggests that by many of the indicators, literacy, healthcare, general standards of living, Cuba, in fact, ranked among the top 5 or 10 countries in all of Latin America, even before Castro. So the idea that Castro gave Cuba literacy, that Castro gave the Cubans health care, that Castro gave them a standard of living that they had not had before, they'd all been sort of starving peasants under the boot of American plantation companies, is an absolute myth. But what did happen, that as Castro's government imposed all this, all the promises became illusions. Let's take education. Yeah. Everybody, like even in the West, has had mandatory, compulsory government education. But far more than even what you'd want to say the party line in public schools with American textbooks and a certain ideological perspective, the fact is it's almost like the breath of fresh air compared to the straitjacket of ideological propaganda that was in every Cuban school, from kindergarten through the university, of communist indoctrination, communist interpretations of history, communist views of the economic and social system, communist manipulation of people's minds to believe and follow and obey anything and everything that the government said. What about health care? Yes, the government opened clinics. But the fact is that these clinics have, virtually because of the bankruptcy and inefficiency and the poverty of the general economic system, on the basis of which government has the resources and the means to do things, has resulted in long lines, poor equipment, a decision by the government who gets what treatment, of what types, at what expense. And then, in fact, The clinics often don't even the essentials of everyday emergency service, from painkillers to Band-Aids. It is an illusion. Now, what did Castro do, creating this myth of the wonderfulness of socialist healthcare? He would then compulsorily send doctors, Cuban doctors, to Africa, to other parts of Latin America. Look, we're giving you our assistance for free. These doctors were forced to do this. They were paid pittance, and they're continued to pay pittance. Nothing that is the real worth of the value and quality that they would normally provide in a private sector to the maintenance and the provision of health care to willing income-earning citizens in a free market economy. Then on top of that, the very nature of a centralized economy like this not only destroys agriculture, results in industrial and economic stagnation, it requires the imposition of ideological conformity. No one can challenge the plan, because to challenge the plan is to undermine the ability of the plan to be achieved. This is a danger that Hayek pointed out in his famous Road to Serfdom book from 1944, that the very notion of the plan and the achievement of the plan as the national goal that the government is imposing in the name of all the people cannot be undermined, not only by people physically refusing to participate, but ideologically failing to have the enthusiasm for it, which would undermine the achievement of the goals, and therefore you would be a social wrecker. That was a term that the Cubans got from the Soviets under Stalin. Any failure was clearly the failure of the people to show them the necessary enthusiasm. Cuba was made a basket case of poverty, third world despair, precisely because of everything Castro did, not in spite of it. And yes, was there an embargo by the United States, which as classical liberal libertarians we would criticize from a variety and sundry perspectives, but it was the U.S. embargo. For most of those years, many European countries were trading with Cuba. Latin American countries soon broke away from the embargo and went trading with Cuba. Cuba had access to most of the world. They cannot blame their economic stagnation and poverty on the United States. Whether the U.S. should have done it, whether it maybe exacerbated the opportunities for certain Cubans, that's a separate issue. But this myth that Cuba's economic hardships are due to the Goliath to the north of them is an absurdity. And it became even worse after the Soviet Union collapsed, because their Soviet sugar daddy was gone. Then they had to go hand in hand to other countries to get special breaks and subsidies and handouts and support, all of which has left Cuba in the economic basket case status that it is now. One can only hope that now with Fidel gone, and I'm going to be very impolitic in the eyes of many on the left. I'm glad he's dead. If I had been alive in April of 1945, I would have been cheering that Hitler was dead. If I had been old enough to appreciate what was happening in March of 1953 when Stalin died, I would have been cheering that the tyrant is dead. I was happy when Mao died, and I'll even be more inhumane. I was happy to see the Romanian dictator Ceausescu dead on the cover of Time magazine. And I'm happy that Fidel Castro is dead. My only disappointment is it wasn't soon enough.
Yeah, the trouble with you, Richard, is that you just kind of mince words and you don't really let people know where you stand. Look, I'm glad you brought up Batista, because Batista really was a dictator himself. I mean, Castro ousted from power, and Castro had a lot of good arguments as to why the Cuban people should oust Batista from power. The guy was brutal. He killed people, but by and large, he permitted free enterprise, or quote free enterprise, to gain a greater hold in Cuba than certainly under a total socialist system that Castro had. So there was obviously more economic prosperity. But I think it's also important to go back to the era that you and I have talked about on this show, the Spanish-American War, which began the long-time U.S. obsession with Cuba. You had the famous Platt Amendment, where U.S. officials demanded the right to control whoever came into power in Cuba. So, Batista, in the eyes of U.S. officials, were fine because he bent the knee to the U.S. government. He would do what they required him to do, and he was free to do whatever he wanted in Cuba. Along comes Castro and inspired lots of Cubans because he argued that for the first time in a long time that Cuba should be truly independent of U.S. control. So in that sense, he was saying something good, that Cuba should be independent from the United States. On the other side, though, was this socialist system that antagonized a lot of Cubans who had supported him. So here he is nationalizing American businesses and nationalizing Cuban homes and businesses, those beautiful mansions, putting all the poor in there. He was doing really what the left here in the United States loves to do. He was equalizing wealth. He was making people equal. And, of course, they turned out that everybody's equal in the sense that everybody has nothing except for Castro and the ruling elite. And so you have this system that really I think you're seeing parts of here in the United States where the system just starts to collapse in on itself because there's no more taxpayers that are able to produce the wealth to fund this gigantic socialist system that's taking care of and employing everybody. And it really is a tyrannical system, as you pointed out. When I visited Cuba many years ago, I asked a guy, I said, what's it like to be living in... Is that you?
Don't worry.
Okay. What's it like to live in a system where the state employs everybody? I mean, to me, it was a shocking notion that everybody's working for the government. And he told me, he says, look, they're never vicious enough. This guy was a libertarian, believe it or not. And so we got to be pretty good friends. And I went over to his house, and he had all these books by Hayek and Friedman. It was quite amazing, Mises. And he told me, look, they're never vicious enough to their opponents or people who question their regime to just throw them out of a job because they know that would be starvation because the state's the sole employer. And he says, but what they do, especially with young people, they'll just transfer them to a city on the other side of the island away from their girlfriend. And so that's the ultimate threat there, that they separate families like that. So, he establishes this brutal system, but I don't think that we should just poo-poo the embargo. I mean, clearly it had an economic effect. It's like squeezing people from two sides of a vice. You've got the socialist system, and then you've got the embargo. I mean, when the U.S. imposed the sugar quotas, I mean, the United States was the biggest market for sugar for Cuban producers. And as part of this retaliation against the nationalization of American businesses, the U.S. imposes a sugar embargo. Okay, do people in Europe eat sugar? Of course. But this was the biggest market. And there's also, transportation costs and other things that are involved with selling to foreigners. I mean, clearly the embargo had a tremendous economic effect. Would it have made a difference? No doubt not, because socialism collapses of its own accord. It impoverishes people. But certainly it aggravated it. And it was really, Richard, an attack on the economic liberty of the American people. I mean, the first question that has to be asked is, what business of what happens in Cuba is of that of the United States government? There's certainly nothing in the Constitution that entitles the government to intervene in a foreign country. When American tourists go abroad, if they get thrown in jail, that's the risk they take. And it's the same with American businesses. You open up a business in Cuba or Mexico or Afghanistan, you run the risk that you might get nationalized. You can't run to your government daddy and ask to be bailed out. So no matter how bad things were in Cuba, the U.S. government had no business intervening in that country with an embargo. And then, of course, there are the repeated assassination attempts. I mean, we've become so accustomed to this notion that the CIA wields the authority to assassinate that very few of us ask the question, under what moral or legal authority are they going to murder somebody? And that's what it is murder. Because a person believes in communism, because he believes in socialism. I mean, when Pinochet's forces came up to the United States to assassinate Orlando Letelier, who was a socialist that had previously served in the Allende administration, which of course the CIA and the Pentagon had ousted in a coup. everybody called it murder because that's what it was. And people were indicted and convicted of murder. But, when the CIA does it, it's totally different. It's okay to murder somebody because he's a socialist or a communist. I say there was absolutely no legal or moral justification for those interventions. Leave Cuba to the Cubans. Is suffering under communism bad? Sure it is. But that doesn't justify the U.S. government from getting involved. Now, let me just make one more point. I'll turn it back to you. The left is horrendous on this. Their hypocrisy when they talk about, free speech and things like that, and then all of a sudden just to poo-poo what Castro's doing because they love his socialist policy shows the moral bankruptcy of the left. But there's also the moral bankruptcy of the right. They preach free enterprise and economic liberty and limited government, and yet here they support this national security state apparatus that is complete omnipotent power to torture and kill and assassinate people and affect regime change operations. And the right supports the core principles of Cuban socialism, Social Security. That's one of Castro's government programs that he was most proud of. Medicare, Medicaid, you mentioned public schooling. These are all institutions that conservatives love, adore, and believe in. And so while they rail against Castro for his tyranny, they love him for his socialist policies.
Well, obviously, you're absolutely correct, and it's a position that you'll recall that when I was making my comments about the embargo, I said this was separate from the issue as to whether the U.S. should have imposed such an embargo. It is obviously the case that this was more a violation of the rights of American citizens. First of all, let's even take the most generous interpretation of the government intruding in such a way, a time of declared war. Okay, it may be still a point of dispute by some classic liberals and libertarians, but during a time of declared war, one understands the rationale of the government saying no ordinary trading or movement of people between you and the country that is a belligerent under a congressionally passed declaration of war. But the point is, there is no declaration of war against Cuba. There is not, and there never has been. It's the fact that the United States government does not like the Cuban government. Now, I personally don't like the Cuban government either. I think my opening remarks make that relatively clear. If I wasn't too hesitant in some of my remarks, perhaps. But the fact is, it is not the business or the concern of the United States government to be telling Americans, private citizens, where they may travel, with whom they may interact, under what terms and with whom they may enter into commercial and financial dealings. And as you said, caveat emptor, the buyer beware. In this case, also the investor beware. If an American company wants to go down and get into some type of a joint venture with the Cuban government, or to cut any kind of a deal to be a supplier of some commodity or service to the Cuban government, and then run the risk of having its property confiscated, its supplies confiscated, the Cuban government failing to meet its contractual obligations to it, or even to be in Cuba on a business trip and get caught in some net of being accused of being a bourgeois spy and being thrown in prison. You buy your ticket and you take your chances, and it is not the concern of the United States government. There have been Americans who have invested in post-Soviet Russia, that is since the 1990s. And many of those businessmen have seen manipulations by the Russian government. Their investments have been seized through various political tricks and gimmickry. Their lives have been threatened. They've been roughed up by the authorities. But the fact is that because Russia has nuclear weapons and the United States want Russia to wheel and deal with it in various areas that is not directly antagonistic in its own foreign policy agenda, they just tell these American citizens implicitly, you're in Russia, there's a corrupt, crony, capitalist, authoritarian government, you buy your ticket and you take your chances, you're on your own. Now, the same logic and philosophy should have been undertaken with Cuba from the start. The government the President of the United States can say, not as president, but as a private citizen myself, I think that communism is wrong. I believe it is brutal, unjust, and dictatorial. And I call upon my fellow Americans as private citizens, as I am speaking to you right now as a private citizen and not as president in the Oval Office, to think about whether you wish to associate with such thugs and criminals, murderers, and tyrants. But as President of the United States, I do not have the authority to command you or restrict you from such interactions with a government that I or maybe even you find morally repugnant. That is a matter of your choice based upon your conscience and how you view as legitimate and proper market opportunities. That's the most that a president of the United States should say. No more and no less, and not what the United States government has done since 1960.
Yeah, because when you think about it, that the real core issue involved with socialism is government control over people's economic activities. People have a right to decide for themselves what to do with their own money, and socialism violates that. But notice what the U.S. reaction to socialism in Cuba has been. Now, this isn't a consistent reaction because, I mean, right now, the U.S. loves Vietnam, which is a socialist system, one in which 58,000 American men were killed by the communist regime in Vietnam. But the U.S. is now making nice with the Vietnamese communists, embracing them, trying to put military bases there, passing a review of Vietnamese communist troops. So it's not a consistent opposition to communism. But notice that while they object to the Cuban communist system, what they do in response to that is based on the same principles the communists and socialists are doing. They're saying, to retaliate, to punish you for adopting the socialist system, we're going to control the economic decisions of our citizens. We're going to put them in jail if they go to Cuba and spend their money in the way they want. The best way to fight socialism or tyranny is through freedom, Richard. I mean, that's what we libertarians stand for. Leave the American people free to travel to Cuba or Vietnam or Russia. Decide for themselves where to spend their money, how to spend their money. In fact, that's the best way to bring down a tyrannical regime. Build up the private sector in Cuba through trade and economic transactions. It may be small, but it starts growing after a while, where people all of a sudden start accumulating a nest egg. And when you've got a larger amount of wealth and savings, it provides a little bit of a backstop for you against a tyrannical regime. And ultimately, it fortifies the private sector to finally take on the regime. But when all you're doing is starving and you're barely eking out a subsistence, your incentive for resisting a tyrannical regime diminishes significantly. So the best thing that we could do at this point is keep pushing toward the lifting of this embargo and the establishment of normal relations. If the president wants to continue, President Trump wants to continue exclaiming against communism and socialism, fine, as you point out. But unleash the American people, liberate them instead of following the road that the socialists and communists have taken.
I think a point that you made a moment ago is that what is the ruling principle of American foreign policy in these affairs? It is pragmatism and expediency to serve the interests of what the Washington foreign policy makers, regardless of administration, believe to be serving the betterment and the interests of the empire. And yes, it is not a formal empire as some countries have had, but the fact is America views itself and will, in his own way, under Trump as well, I presume, that it is in some form policeman of the world. Trump will just want better deals to arrange to be the policeman, but the policeman of the world. It goes back to thinking that started with Franklin Roosevelt. There's a story that a reporter once asked FDR during the Second World War, how is it that we're fighting fascists in Europe like Hitler and Mussolini, but we support a fascist dictator like Trujillo in the Dominican Republic? To which supposedly Roosevelt turned up with his cigarette holder and said, Trujillo, he's a fascist, but he's our fascist. That has been the thinking of the United States government since the Second World War, that it doesn't matter if a political leader in another country is a brutal tyrant who even uses American economic and military aid to suppress and butcher his own people as long as he's viewed as a friend of America in the wider context of the global alliances and competitions around us, as many of these third world countries were during the Cold War in Latin America, in places like Africa and Asia. They could be tyrants who used our military aid to oppress their own people, having nothing to do with real or imaginary communist insurrections in their territories. But as long as they supported the United States, allowed U.S. military and access, supported the U.S. at the UN, and et cetera, that's all that they were concerned with in determining whether you were friend or foe. And that shows that it has nothing to do with ideology or some underlying grand philosophical principle. It has to do with preservation of the United States' dominance of the world. Our empire, right or wrong.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, we see it in Latin America. We saw it with the support of the Pinochet tyranny. We saw it with respect to the tyranny that the U.S. brought into existence after its coup in Guatemala. And we saw it in Iran with the installation of the Shah and the support of his brutal regime all the way up until the time of the Iranian Revolution. We see it today in Egypt, with the military dictatorship in Egypt. And your point about Trump making a deal, it really is good. I mean, because this is the way they think, that it has to be negotiated, that lifting the embargo and leaving Cuba alone has to be managed, and we have to get a better terms on it. We have to force them to agree to do certain things. None of that is necessary to establish a free society here at home. All that Trump has to do is just unilaterally lift the embargo, unilaterally abandon Guantanamo, finally, to the Cubans. It belongs to them. Bring all those troops home and let them have that land. In other words, everything can be done unilaterally when it comes to liberty. Nothing has to be the subject of a deal or managed trade or negotiated freedom, because freedom isn't negotiable.
Right, and I would just add, as a subscript digression to what you just said, all of this talk that Trump has about that he doesn't like the Pacific Trade Agreement, he's dubious about the Atlantic Trade Agreement with the European Union, he wants to renegotiate NAFTA. All he has to do is to say, as of this day X, the U.S. government, well, obviously some of it would have to be voted by Congress, will declare unilaterally that the United States is a vast free trade zone, not only within the borders of the United States, but with the rest of the world. We don't need NAFTA. We don't need a Pacific Trade Agreement. We don't need an Atlantic Trade Agreement. We don't need a Latin American Trade Agreement. The United States now recognizes the right of every American citizen as producer and consumer to freely and peacefully interact with any buyer and seller anywhere, any place else in the world. End of story. In that sense, he can get away with the crony deals that have been involved in many of these international trade deals through the GATT agreements and so on, and the World Trade Organization, just by declaring the United States is now open for trade with anyone under any circumstances as long as it is honest and peaceful. And that would be the ethical and principled position to take, including the trade with Cuba.
It would also be the most monumentally positive development in the history of liberty in this country. It would be absolutely fantastic. Talk about an anti-establishment earthquake. I mean, here the man has a chance to really lead America in a different direction. Time will tell whether he's going to or whether he's going to follow the same old path. My hunch is it's going to be the latter, but one never knows. Through the power of ideas, people might force him to move in the direction that you're talking about. On that note, Richard, we need to wrap. Yep, go ahead.
I'll just say, you'll know you're starting to influence him when Trump starts sending out positive tweets about FFF.
It's a good sign. All right. On that happy note, we'll wrap things up. Richard, enjoyed it as always. Thank you all for viewing, and we'll see you next week.
Take care. Until next time.